So, Elizabeth Tracey, thanks so much for being here and talking to us about your inspiring work. So, I guess where I'd really like to start is your background as a chaplain, a journalist, a storyteller, and love to hear about your project. So, why don't you tell us about who you are?
Well, thank you for that. And thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk with you today. Both of my roles at Johns Hopkins are synthetic in that my first role at Johns Hopkins was as a medical journalist. And so in that role, I produced a daily radio spot that's broadcast on CBS radio nationally and a number of other outlets, both nationally and internationally. It was actually that got me into the chaplain role because about 15 years ago, there was a seminal study that was in the New England Journal of Medicine that was looking at the role of palliative care in extending lifespans in people with stage 4 lung cancer. And what it showed was that the folks who got the palliative care lived on average 4 months longer than the other people who received standard care. So when I followed up that story at Hopkins with the faculty member who was head of palliative care, I learned at the time that was a new specialty, that chaplains had a role on that team. So then I followed that up. I went to go talk with the head of spiritual care and chaplaincy at Hopkins, and I asked to shadow a chaplain. And she said, "Sure, you can shadow a chaplain, but why don't you just join the program?" So I
Right.
did. And so I did 4 units of CPE. I became board certified. That was about 8 years ago. And I've been in that role largely on the medical intensive care unit at Johns Hopkins Hospital at the main hospital ever since.
So,
So that's how I got there.
yeah, yeah. So, are you saying you started first as a journalist and then eased into being a chaplain? That's
That is
fascinating.
correct. That's
Yeah.
correct. But I'd had a previous exposure to sort of that world because I used to volunteer in hospice and I would go and do respite care for families who had a person dying at home
Right.
and they wanted to go get their hair done or go grocery shopping or whatever. And that, incidentally, is also one of the places where I learned my love of story because there's nothing like the bedside of somebody who really can't ambulate, can't get out of bed to really hear a lot of amazing stories. And so I heard great stories in that role. And I
Yeah.
think that maybe planted the seed.
So, yeah, is there something about being at bedside for the patient? Well, you being at the bedside listening, have you found that in that situation, they're thinking more stories? Do they become, do you think, more reflective in a moment of crisis, in a moment of poor health? How does that affect the stories, do you think, that they're telling you?
I think that's a really excellent perception on your part. And my current thinking on this is that when people are faced with critical illness or death, they don't have time to maintain what I call the carapace. So, that hard cover that we all often employ when we're
Right.
out there interacting in the world. And in those situations, there's just no time for that. It's clear that it's really irrelevant, and people drop it. And then they start talking about the things that have been really meaningful to them. And when they have somebody sitting there who really has no other agenda other than really hearing that, like, and being interested in that, most people tend to really step up to that space and share a lot about who they are.
Yeah, I can imagine that it's often been said that on your deathbed you're not going to be thinking about, boy, I wish I had done more work. You're going to be self-reflecting on the things that were really important to you. Is that has that been your experience?
That has been my experience. And the other thing that I learned is a lot of wisdom and a lot of perceptions of here's what has been the meaning that I have gleaned as a result of this journey. And these are the messages that I would give out to people as a result of this journey and at this point in it.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing that's so amazing to me is the variability. I almost never hear the same thing from anybody.
Hmm.
when it comes to what's really meaningful to me or what do I think is really important. I feel really blessed in that I have a very avid mind for reading. So I do a lot of reading of all different genre.
Hmm.
So that's a great exposure. And I think that the story, I will say, I think to some degree, a lot of my heritage is Irish. And the Irish, as you know, are famous racketeers and love stories. So I think that some of it is my DNA, that I'm just persuaded by that. And ultimately, I mean, my view of this is at the end of the day, that's really the only thing that matters. The
Hmm.
rest of it is really just a bunch of data points. And the thing that matters is who are you? And how have you journeyed through this opportunity for being here in this time, in this place? And everybody's story is unique.
Yeah.
Sure. So, as a result of both hats at Hopkins, I developed this intervention during COVID, very much at the beginning of COVID in April of 2020. And as I said, I spent most of my time on the MICU, on the medical intensive care unit at Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I had a friend and a colleague, a clinician there. And very early on, I was interviewing him for the radio spot on point of care ultrasound for cardiac and pulmonary abnormalities secondary to COVID. And then, as I do very frequently with the faculty at Hopkins, I switched hats on him and I was chaplain. And I asked him, well, look, how's it going with all these patients? And at the time, as I'm sure you would imagine, the MICU got the sickest of the sick. And that was really almost everyone was intubated, sedated, prone, and there were no visitors allowed in the hospital. So this clinician said to me, it's terrible. I am struggling so much. I don't know anything about my patients. When they die, the only thing I know about them are their ventilator settings and how many pressors they were on. And literally in a flash, in that flash, I said, I think I can help with this. And I said, why don't I reach out to the loved ones of the patients who were not allowed to come to the hospital? And I'll conduct an interview because, of course, I do nothing but interviews. And let's find out who they are. And because I knew a lot about the culture on the unit and I knew that time was also an issue, I kept those interviews to 2 minutes or less. So, per your notion of the storytelling, because I have that storytelling ear, I would look for the things that were unique, that were going to enable this person to stand out for the team so that they would be able to resonate with the humanity of that and their own humanity. And so that's exactly what happened. We got all the requisite permissions and we started recording the loved ones of all of these patients who had COVID, almost 100% of them who were on the unit, and the team used it on rounds. And the way rounds work on that unit is everybody has a mobile computer on a cart, and this big clot of physicians and NPs and nurses all go outside of each patient's room and they talk about this is what's happening with this patient. And that's when they would play the TIMS file. And everybody would know who was this person. Was this guy a professor of astrophysics at Hopkins or whatever it was, that their beloved French Bull Terrier was their favorite thing. And they learned all of those details about the person. And then we expanded those TIMS files even further. We used them at end of life for the patient. So here, imagine your loved one talking about you, right? And great stories about you and all that. And if we acknowledge that most of us feel that hearing is the last sensation to stop before somebody actually leaves their corporal being, we would play those files for people at end of life
Hmm.
so that the last thing they heard was their loved one talking about them in incredible loving ways. So then
Hmm.
as time went on, we also used them in family meetings. So in family meetings, as you know, that's where we're talking about transitions of care, where somebody's condition largely has deteriorated and the machine, the medical machine, which is what I call it, is reaching the end of its utility. And we really want to say, all right, what does the next step look like? So here's a story. We had a patient who had identified that his favorite thing was to ride his Harley. And he and his wife used to take the Harley and they went to the dollar store. And then they would go up and down the aisles and they would try to find unusual things, which I gather in dollar stores is pretty common. And they'd show them to each other. And that was like his favorite activity. He loved to do it. And his condition had deteriorated so far that everyone in that room knew there was no way this man was ever going to get back on his Harley. And that enabled his wife to make the most loving decision she could as far as what was the thing that he would want. And everybody just could resonate with the truth of the decision making that she came to and support her in that decision. So we use them for that also. And then you've asked me before, how did it get distilled into just the 4 questions, which is where it is now? The 4 questions: how do you want to be addressed? What brings you joy? What does the medical team need to know about you to care for you best? And what brings you peace? All 4 of those questions are directly related to all that experience during the pandemic, because we didn't just stay on the MICU, we went into the whole hospital. And so we ended up with a lot of these stories that were able to distill that into what is likely to result in the greatest yield regarding actionable information that the team can actually work on. It'll standardize it so they know what to expect, and it will be succinct. We're going to be able to get it into that space, be sensitive to the fact that, as you know, teams in the hospital are beleaguered. They don't have a lot of time. So a current TIMS file is about 1:30 long. And the patients, usually the patient themselves, but sometimes still their loved one, answers those 4 questions on their behalf. And they all came from the experience. So, for example, the name: how do you want to be addressed? Well, clearly that's a sign of respect, but it's also, and here's a story, it came from a sister of a patient we had on the unit. And she said, every time the team calls me to tell me about my brother, they say, Michael, Michael, Michael. But his name is not Michael. His name is Chubby. They need to call him Chubby. Well, why is it important? It's important because the rate of delirium, especially in an ICU, is so high. And if somebody calls you by a name that you're not accustomed to, you're not going to respond to that. So this really helps people to respond in that way. And it's also respectful. If you want to be called Mr. Jones, we'll call you Mr. Jones. It's okay if that's your particular desire. It's okay. Then joy. I mean, it's fairly obvious why joy is important. It's so that we can help to elicit that for you while you're in this situation that nobody wants to be in. And what's the team need to know? Another story. We had a patient who got very cold in the hospital, and she liked her blankets to be up on top of her nose and looped around her ears. That's how she wanted her blankets to be, but she didn't tell anybody that. Her daughter recorded her TIMS file, and then we knew. And then we could all start doing that. And she was so happy because she was seen. She was seen as an individual, not just a case that was sitting on the unit for 2 months. And then finally, the peace story, also direct experience. We had a Jewish man who was on the unit, and what brought him peace was his faith. Mm-hmm. And so his son recorded both a psalm and a blessing for his father. And he did those in Hebrew. And the man was hospitalized with us for 2 months, and he kept requesting, sometimes up to 10 times a day, the nurses to play that file for him, which they did. And they told me, oh, it was so, really got tired of doing that. And it was so meaningful to this patient to be able to hear his son's voice giving him this blessing. All of this to say that my agenda is that medicine is about people. It's about people ultimately. And all of its capabilities and amazing science and all the rest of that stuff, that's all really great. And ultimately, it's about you and me. And it's about reducing suffering. And it's about saying, beloved, I can't fix this, and I can still hearken to your spirit.
Yeah.
So that's what it's about for me.
And so those questions really do get to the spirit of the person. because yeah, as you're saying, the name is extremely important in terms of how people identify themselves, how people what people call them. I love the different nicknames from what I heard that people had. But also, you mentioned something that's really important: the idea of these are actionable statements. So, do you find that if the patient says, "This is what gives me joy. This is what gives me peace," that informed the family members themselves? Maybe they never heard this put in quite this way, and then they would actually work to provide joy and peace to the patient.
Yes. And so you heard, as you listened to those files, people identifying music, for example.
Right.
And that's such a primary thing. And we have that capability in everyone's room to play the music of their choice. And so if they're a jazz fan, we can play jazz. That's
Right.
easy, isn't it? To walk in and say, Mr. Jones, wow, I understand that you really like jazz. Let's put it on. Or they really like game shows. Well, we can put on game shows. We can help to satisfy that need and then support that aspect of who they are.
Yeah.
Because that's absolutely just as important as all the rest of the stuff. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's such a different question. You could say to them, what music do you like? What TV shows do you like? But if you ask them specifically, what brings you joy? What brings you peace? You're gonna get something. Well, it's an open-ended question that tells you quite a bit about what gives them joy and peace in their own particular way, rather than going down a
Exactly
list
right.
of things. These closed-ended questions.
Now, you know this very well. That the best thing to do is to ask the question. And then I say this all the time, and then shut up.
Yeah.
Right? Just sit back and wait for, I'm just going to sit here until you tell me what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah.
And I have nothing but time. So I'll just sit here and be patient until you're ready and until you think about things. I think I sent you one file, didn't I, of Kenneth Gant,
I'm not sure.
who he's the guy who said that he really likes to debate.
No, I didn't hear that one yet.
Oh, I have to send it to you. I'm going to send you this because two other places where these are extremely important. Mr. Gant died, and we provided the file to his family. And I have this recording, not just of him, which is really very charming, but of his daughter talking about how meaningful it was to her to be able to have this and to her extended family. So routinely, we will provide it to the family if the patient dies, so that then they have that. And it's really an important thing because we've talked about this, this actual recording of their voice. It's like a snapshot of them when they were on this side of the veil, right?
Right.
In a powerful way. It's them speaking themselves. And so, so we try to provide it at that point too. In the study that we published on the staff in the MICU, there is a qualitative analysis of what the staff says. And the staff says a lot of really powerful things. For example, the attendings say that it enables them to go into a room and already have some knowledge about the patient. And that helps to establish trust right away because they've taken the time to listen to it. And the patient frequently, like I've heard both sides of that. So again, here's another story. So I had a patient who told me that what brought him joy was his goats.
It's
And he
goats.
was a goat farmer and he farmed goats for meat, right? So his goats were all ultimately slaughtered, but even so, he still gave them all names. And I was so amazed by that. When I did the recording, I said, really? And then when they come to take them away, you say, bye, Bill. It was really great knowing you. I mean, really? So you name them? I just don't think I would name animals that I was raising for meat. This was so singular and so unique. And the whole medical staff on that unit were just amazed by it. And he told me, because he was with us for about 2 weeks, that he just thought it was so amazing. It made him feel so good that so many people would come in and ask him about his goats, that they cared enough to listen to that hymn just answering those 4 questions, it was such a powerful healing for him. And the staff loved it. I have a lot of the staff, physicians, nurses, all kinds of people tell me that it really helps them to connect with
Mm-hmm.
that humanity and with their own humanity. So that's a really important thing.
Yeah.
And I've said this, I think I said this already in one of our previous conversations. The humans in medicine are not limited to the patients. The humans in medicine are all the clinicians too. And that's why I started NODA, the No One Dies Alone. And it's also why I developed TIMS, because of the clinicians and because of the patent distress that I saw in their eyes about I can't connect with
Mm-hmm.
this person. So I think that when we're looking at things like burnout, we need to enable all of us to resonate with that humanity and say, you know what, it's okay if this makes you feel sad because you too are human.
Yeah, I love how you have kind of overcome the business model of medicine, which requires increasingly short visits, more patients, a focus on the biomedical discourse. So by quote subcontracting this out to you, you're able to provide something that perhaps they couldn't do or they don't have time to do. I think I'm talking about the physicians themselves, and then you amplify the voice of the patient, whom and multiple people can hear. Not just even assuming a physician would do that, ask those questions, it would stay in the room, I suppose. But I love the idea that it can be then viewed and listened to by a number of different people, including the family members as well as the staff at all levels,
And the patient themselves.
and the patient themselves.
So, sure.
Do they
And
do they want to hear themselves after they're recorded? I mean, sometimes you say things, but you don't understand what you've just said. Are they ever surprised by their own statements? Has anybody ever said that?
no, I've never had anybody in the hundreds of recordings I've done. I've never had anybody express surprise at the things they've said. I have absolutely had them say a lot. Gosh, I have to think about this for a minute. Nobody ever asked me this before.
Right.
No one has ever asked me this before.
Yeah.
And to have to ruminate for a little bit before they actually step into that space and start to answer it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it is easy. We can do this. We can include it as part of the medical record. And it is, I think, important in helping to establish that communication. And that is what one of the studies, when you get the opportunity to look at it, absolutely shows. 95% of them said, 99% of them said improves communication between the loved ones, the patient, and the team.
Yeah. Where do you intend to take this project? What's the future?
Well, the future is the institution put resources into development of an app so that recording will be able to be done by anybody and it will automatically populate the record, the electronic health record of the patient. So we have employed AI to do the editing because, as you can imagine, I'm sure, a couple things. One thing is most people aren't really fluid when they're answering those questions. And so everybody's recording needs a little bit of editing. And also, the hospital is a very noisy place. So you have to noise reduce it because you don't want to hear the beeps and all the rest of the things that are going on in there all the time. So those two things are important. And we were supposed to have had this app available. We first developed it in the iOS system, and it should be available within the next couple months. And then we'll develop an Android-based one. And then, of course, we're going to validate it and test it and all that sort of thing in the health system. And then the intention is to make it available in we use Epic. So Epic has this thing that's called the App Orchard. So anybody who uses Epic would be able to access it and be able to then purchase it and utilize it in their health system so that they can do it also. So that's one intention. The other thing, and that's in the works. The other thing that we're doing right now, just started this study this week, is we're doing TIMS recordings for the entire staff on one of the units at Johns Hopkins Hospital. So everybody, the attendings, the fellows, the nurses, the PTs, the OTs, everybody. And we're putting that into a shared drive. And then we're going to be doing a little like daily like email that's going to sort of focus on one particular person, and their TIMS file. And the objective here, what we're specifically studying, is we've noticed an unfortunate phenomenon in the wake of COVID. COVID really, as I said before, kind of broke down all kinds of barriers, and now they're all back in place. Right. And so we want to see if this TIMS file and in this little focus of everybody on the unit on a daily basis that we'll get through everybody helps to break down some of those barriers, especially interdisciplinary barriers. And that's what we're looking at with that. And ultimately, where I would like to see this is I would like to see every patient. So let's say you're going to come to Johns Hopkins. As part of your intake, we would send you a link and we would say, hey, you know what? We have this intervention where we're trying to really know something about you as a person. Could you please, here's these 4 questions, dial this number and record these 4 questions for us before your visit. And while you're at it, if you would send in a picture of yourself that you like, or doing your favorite activity, or with your favorite dog, or whatever, we'd like that to be a part of your record also. That's what I would ultimately like to see.
Are other hospitals expressing interest in this project?
Yes. And so I have had multiple conversations. So there's a group at Vanderbilt that's looking at it. I've talked to folks in North Carolina. I mean, I've talked to a number, and in the UK, because the UK has a very robust program as part of their National Health Service that's called Patient Voices. And that was actually a video-based snapshot, if you will, of the patient and who they are. The disadvantage, there's so many disadvantages to video. It takes up a lot of bandwidth. Right. People don't want to watch it on a unit. There's a lot of questions about privacy, and it takes a lot of expertise to put one together. And most people don't like the way they look in video. And that doesn't happen with an audio file. It's really small. It's easily modified. It can get loaded up really quickly. And so they've been quick to see the advantage of that. I think right now the rate limiting step for any other institution to adopt this is really going to be the development and release of the app. I think once that's in place, I think it'll really become a lot more widespread.
So that you'd really be able to then to gather so many more interviews if the patient is doing this themselves and they see this as part of the process of being admitted to the hospitals. I'm wondering, do the patients ever get to hear the staff interviews, the staff audios as well, to get to know the staff and what?
So that's ultimately our objective. So this study that I just started is on the neurocritical care units of the NCCU at Johns Hopkins Hospital. So that ultimately what we want to do is provide those files. Like we could curate them in a way that if you're a patient, you could have those files for your whole team, for your attending, for your nurse, for your respiratory therapist, everybody. You could listen to like, who is this person? And that's ultimately the objective. And again, the objective is to reduce barriers to communication. If you find out that your attending has a lab and you're a lab owner, that's a point of contact, right? That you guys can immediately start talking about, well, do you like chocolate labs or yellow labs, or do you like whatever, is your dog a water dog, and so forth. And so that. I mean, if you have a point of commonality between you that you can identify, then that makes it all so much easier. and more
Yeah.
human also.
Well, yeah, your work has been so much in humanizing the patient. I don't think anybody's ever thought in this way of how to humanize the staff to the patients. Um, so it's just a
And they
great
should
idea.
be, right? Because
Yeah,
they're people too, and they come with their
right.
full range of capabilities and hurts and sadness and things that have happened and ways that they react to things. And none of those are going to be communicated in a TIMS file. But if these providers, so I've interviewed the head of the unit and another provider, and they talk so clearly about, what brings me joy. Well, within that context, what brings them joy is clear communication between everybody and the feeling that they're understood and that everybody's on the same page in terms of trying to get this person well. And when people make statements like that, those are like little emotional contracts. And you can trust somebody, I think, more when you hear them articulate that.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm hoping we're going to see out of that study. And you were very smart to pick out that part. We've got to make sure we get everybody recorded first, and then we need to get their permission to share it with patients.
It really just is another innovative way of flattening the hierarchy. Uh, in getting people to acknowledge we're all human, we all have our stories, different things bring us joy. Let's work together to get through this. It's just a wonderful project, and I can't wait to hear more about what you're doing and the results of your research. So,
Well, it's really lovely, the things that you say. And as you know, it can be a very demoralizing environment, medicine,
yeah.
and especially a quaternary care medicine environment. And it's really quite valuable to me to hear your reflections, and I really appreciate them. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. And so, I'm sure we're going to be talking more about this in the future. So, thank you so much for your time here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.